Hello everyone, I'm Inverse, and today we're taking a look at the first major balance patch for Company of Heroes 3. There's a lot of changes in here, but I'm going to sort of highlight what I think are the biggest impact, the most interesting, and let you know how I think they're going to affect the meta going forward. Before we get started, it's important to note that there was an issue applying some of the changes in this patch, and Relic has announced that there will be a follow-up patch that will address those issues. So I will be talking as if all these changes exist, but the changes highlighted in red will not be implemented until the follow-up balance patch. I'll also be posting a link to the patch notes in the description so you can follow along yourselves and take a look at some of the changes I don't cover directly. Now, the first big changes we have are to the American faction. Americans pretty much got buffed across the board. As you can see down here, a lot of changes to individual units. But two things I want to focus on particularly. First is this line right here. The motor pool fuel cost decreased from 55 to 45. Now, a 10 fuel decrease may not seem like a big deal. However, we're talking about a tech tier that is very rushed. And what I mean by that is the motor pool has the M8, and the M8 is generally a very good unit to rush to in the early and mid game. And speeding up that M8 by 10 fuel, in my opinion, will have a pretty big impact on the strength of that unit, especially considering Wehrmacht in particular does not really have fantastic mobile counters to this unit in the mid game. So very, very high impact change here. We're going to see a lot more M8s. We're going to see a lot more M8s have a lot more strength in the early and mid game. Now, the second American change that I really wanted to highlight is the buffs to the airborne battle group. Now, to my sort of opinion, the airborne battle group is already extremely powerful. Paratroopers are already very good. This makes them even better. So we have a bazooka cost decrease from 90 munitions to 15 munitions. Again, this doesn't really seem like a big deal. However, when you consider you're getting multiple paratroopers in a game, this could be the difference between having a paratrooper with a bazooka and having two paratroopers both with bazookas. When we're talking about 180 versus 150 for two of these upgrades, you start to see how that 15 munitions can sort of snowball. Another very interesting change is the reduction in cost of this anti-tank gun from 330 to 250. Now, I'm going to talk about why I'm a little disappointed anti-tank guns didn't get more love later in the video, but in this instance, I do think this elevates the anti-tank gun from being probably not worth it in terms of a mid-game anti-tank option to potentially being good if you need heavier duty AT support that your paratroopers can't provide in the mid-game because you haven't been able to prevent your opponents from teching. Overall, I do think Americans will be better, but I don't see super crazy paradigm shifting, meta shifting changes in these patch notes. Next up, we have the British forces. Once again, similar to Americans, a lot of buffs across the board here. A lot of infantry changes, specifically increases in short-range damage for a lot of infantry to make them very, like, a little more viable in comparison to infantry sections. But the first thing I really want to highlight here is the changes to the AT rifles. Now, this is pretty significant because prior to this patch, AT rifles were almost always the best option to upgrade your infantry sections with, and that was because they provided a lot of anti-tank damage while also not really sacrificing anti-infantry damage. And that's because the AT rifles destroyed cover at an insane rate and actually provided AoE damage that would splash onto infantry units and deal decent damage as well. So you weren't really sacrificing anything in terms of anti-infantry by getting AT rifles. That's changed now. As you can see here, we've got a fairly significant reduction in damage against both buildings and cover, and we also have the AoE damage removed. So basically what's happened here is AT rifles have gone from a no-brainer that you could probably get on all of your infantry sections and be totally fine to finally being a situational AT upgrade that they should have been from the beginning, where now if you are going to decide what you want to build on your infantry sections, you're going to have to decide between sacrificing infantry strength for anti-tank strength or sacrificing anti-tank strength for anti-infantry strength. Overall, I think this is a great change, and it definitely pushes the unit in the right direction in terms of having to make trade-offs between one strength versus the other. The other change I wanted to highlight here was the cost reductions for the M3 Stuart. As you can see, the Stuart previously was a 40 fuel unlock, sort of tech upgrade to unlock the construction of a 45 fuel unit. This has been changed to 25 fuel for the upgrade and 35 for the unit. So we're talking about a 25 fuel decrease. And if I thought a 10 fuel decrease on the M8 timing was fast, I'm sure you can tell what I think about this Stuart timing. I do think this will cause us to see a lot more Stuarts. They're going to come a lot earlier. They're going to be a lot more effective for longer periods of time. And I think Brits kind of now have a viable mid-game vehicle. We'll have to see how it plays out, obviously. Another very big change here is the combination of the reload increase and the insane, basically 100% penetration increase. Now, I haven't tested these yet, so I'm not sure how they will act in practice, but in general, we're looking at a Stuart that's going to come earlier, do a lot more damage, and be a lot more viable against armor. Now that finally brings us to the Wehrmacht section of the patch notes, which is where Relic really started to drop the nerf hammer. I'm going to skip through some of these earlier changes. There isn't anything super crazy here. A bit of a reduction in tier 4 cost, or an increase rather in tier 4 cost. Some other various changes. But the big changes, I believe, are down here on the heavier vehicles and the battle group. So we have the Whirlwind getting a fairly significant nerf in terms of accuracy, damage, and cooldown. This is generally going to make this unit a bit weaker in all stages of the game, and also weaker in terms of rushing, which we'll get to again a little bit further down. Next up is the Panzer IV. The Panzer IV really didn't get hit too hard. However, there was a 10 manpower and 10 fuel cost increase. The 10 fuel is pretty significant in my opinion, especially late game when you're trying to build a lot of these things. But overall, not a huge deal. There was a population cap increase here. I really don't think that will affect 1v1s. It's probably more of a change for team games. Now, the last change that I really wanted to highlight was the Luftwaffe battle group changes. Now, the question that I had, at least when I was looking at these changes initially, was, is the Luftwaffe strategy that we've been seeing a lot lately with people paradropping Panzer Pioneers all around the map, rushing to Whirlwinds, and then eventually to tier 4, is that going to basically be killed? And in my opinion, the answer to that is a pretty resounding no. I do think the strategy is significantly weaker now, but I'm gonna have to try it out and play it through and see for myself. But just like looking at these changes, I don't see significant nerfs to that particular build. Now, the two big changes are, of course, to the combat group and the infantry reserves, which is the Whirlwind and Jaeger call-in and the Fallschirmjäger call-in. Now, the combat group nerf I do think is fairly significant. We're talking about going from 3 to 4 command points, and in my experience, in most of my games, I would have the manpower and fuel basically waiting and ready to go right when I hit 3 command points to call in this off map. That's going to be delayed now by a full command point, which is probably going to give your opponent a minute, if not more, of additional prep time to actually field counters to your Whirlwind and make it less effective from the moment it steps on the field. So in that sense, I do think that strategy was weakened. However, I don't see any changes to any other sort of aspects of the core strategy. I absolutely still think it's viable, and I'm going to continue trying it out and look for a video on that subject probably in the near future. Now, next up on the list for nerfs is, of course, Afrikakorps. Afrikakorps has sort of been in Relic's crosshairs ever since they released their shotgun day after release patch, basically hammering all of the off-map abilities and drastically increasing their costs. There's a lot of nerfs in these patch notes. Honestly, nothing super insane, but two things I really want to focus on. The first is the 205 light carrier. Now, this is the early game half track, similar to the Panzer Elite half tracks from Company of Heroes 1, and they got some fairly significant nerfs here. There's a slight manpower nerf, but the big changes are in the damage. 25% reduction in damage short range, 50% long range. Now, I'm sure if any of you had watched my previous video on my American Pathfinder's airborne strategy, there was a clip at the very beginning about a a pair of Pathfinders taking on a 205 light carrier and basically getting it down to 25% health while taking very little damage themselves. These are very fragile units already, but they were fairly powerful in combination with Panzer Grenadiers. This makes them very support oriented. They're not really going to be running around doing much damage at all on their own, and they're really going to have to be kept near Panzer Grenadiers to really babysit them. So this is a fairly significant nerf, in my opinion, to the early game effectiveness of this one unit. Now next up, we have a unit that a lot of people have probably been searching for in these patch notes to see what was going to happen to them, and that's the Gustatori squad. Now this is an infantry squad that you can equip with 2 flamers. They're a call-in. They're extremely powerful. They're extremely annoying to play against. And honestly, this is a pretty minor nerf, in my opinion, in comparison to sort of the overall strength of this unit. We've got a 10% manpower cost increase, a 10% flamethrower cost increase, and a very slight armor reduction. So hopefully these units are going to be a little easier to kill. But overall, I think if you enjoyed using these guys and you enjoyed running around with 2 flamethrowers killing everything that moves, you're still going to be able to do that. So now that we're at the end of the main sort of high impact changes, in my opinion, I want to talk about a few things that are missing from this patch note that I'm a little disappointed by. The first is lack of any changes for AT guns. Now, in my opinion, AT guns in Company of Heroes 3 are extremely difficult to use. They're extremely weak. They have very poor accuracy. Their lack of mobility makes them very challenging to use against highly mobile late game tank strategies that a lot of players use. And the fact that you can only recrew AT guns with 2 units means they're extremely difficult to use. In battles, if you're trying to recrew a squad, you can recrew and you get 2 units on a very fragile anti-tank gun, and if you lose just one of those units, the entire squad's going to retreat. You're going to have a decrewed weapon again, and you're going to have to try to recrew it again. I think being able to select somehow the number of units that will recrew onto a AT gun would be a fantastic change, but just in general, making them a bit more useful, making them more accurate, making them a better, more compelling late and mid-game option, I think would go a long way. So a little sad that I don't see any AT gun changes. And last up, and probably most important for me, is the absolute lack of flamethrower changes in this patch. Flamethrowers to me in Company of Heroes 3 just feel insanely strong. They do so much damage no matter what your opponent's unit health is. They have ridiculous range, and when you have squads like the Gustatori squad that can run around with 2 of them, they're just, in my opinion, not super fun to play against right now. And I don't love just sort of their no-brainer utility at basically all points in the game, to the point where late game you're almost better as, you know, someone like Americans just getting a ton of flamethrower squads over something like Bard rifles. So I'm really sad to see that we don't have any sort of, you know, changes to flamethrowers as a mechanic in this patch. Now I do know it's very early days. This is sort of the first balance patch. There's a lot of time left. There's a lot of time to make these changes. However, I do think flamethrowers are a bit ridiculous right now. They're a little bit broken. They're a little bit of a no-brainer, and I really hope we get some changes on that front ASAP. Well, that's all I've got for you. Thanks for watching. If you want to take a look at the patch notes yourself, again, like I said, you can find a link in the description. If you want to catch me live at any time, I'm streaming a lot over on twitch.tv/InverseTV. And if you want to share your replays, upload replays, download replays from the community, I encourage you to check out cohdb.com. Thanks for watching, guys. I appreciate the support. As always, I appreciate all the warm comments after my my most recent video, my first video in almost 10 years. So thank you very much. It means the world to me. I really appreciate it, and keep an eye out. I'll be posting a lot more in the near future. So yeah, thanks again for watching, and like always, have fun in your games.